Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome you to another wonderful CLASSICOPIA concert here at First Congregational Church. We are so thankful for everybody here, Brian and Reverend Silver, for opening up this wonderful acoustical space. We've been sort of making this our home, I think, for about the last 7 or 8 years, and it's always great to be back. This concert, we had hoped to do this in February during Black History Month, but we had a postponement, so we're glad that we could do this here at the end of March, and hopefully introduce some composers that you may not know, and some pieces that are really fantastic and deserve to be heard a lot more often. My partners in this concert are wonderful brother and sister team, Emmanuel and Frances Borowsky. They came up from Baltimore with me on Thursday. You might know their sister, Elizabeth, a wonderful pianist. She now lives up here in the Upper Valley, is now vice president of CLASSICOPIA as well. As a family, they've been playing together since they were 6, 7, 8 years old, taking wonderful trips all around the world to Lithuania and Cuba and all sorts of cool places to play music. So it's always great to be able to get them to come to this program. So today we're going to introduce some composers. The second and third pieces that we're going to play are all based on the spiritual tradition. After the intermission, we'll get more of the blues tradition and how that related into this music. But we thought we would begin with something that you're probably familiar with, and that's some ragtime, especially 2 works by Scott Joplin, who is sort of the king of ragtime. He was born in 1868 in Texarkana. His mother was a cleaning lady for the white people in town, and she would sometimes drag along Scott with her when she went to clean. And if there was a piano in their homes, he would just sit down and start playing it. And word spread about this young kid who could just play anything he wanted. And it was fortunate that in town was a German immigrant named Julius Weiss, who agreed to take on young Joplin for free and taught him not only how to play piano, but also all about theory and writing music. And so he was one of the rare ragtime pianists who could actually write down their rags in the beginning. This music really started in the brothels and saloons along the Mississippi River and would have been just sort of improvised by the pianist there, but they wouldn't write down what they were doing, and so the next day it would be a whole different ragtime. But for Scott Joplin, when he was 13 years old, he decided to leave home and head along the Mississippi and start playing in a lot of these saloons. And he ultimately ended up in Sedalia, Missouri, and started working for the Maple Leaf Club there, and that's why there's the Maple Leaf Rag. Very quickly, it was clear that he was writing some really great music. In 1903, he would write The Entertainer, which you will hear first. And then a couple years later, the ragtime dance that we're going to do, he actually wrote it as a sort of longer work, and it was meant to be choreographed with dancers and a narrator, but it was not so successful in that form, so we kind of redid it as a ragtime piano piece. And in that, you'll hear there's something he uses called stop time, sometimes called stomp time, where you'll hear, we'll stomp the floor. Don't be worried, which is just part of the music, and it helps give the beat. The cool thing about ragtime, it really took over the world when it started in the late 1890s, in the first decade of the 20th century. There was something about it, the syncopation, that you'd have this left hand keeping the beat and the melody in the right hand always off the beat. We have a wonderful account from a German immigrant who came here in 1904, heard ragtime for the first time, and he wrote back to his wife the following. Suddenly, I discovered that my legs were in a condition of great excitement. They twitched as though charged with electricity and betrayed a considerable and rather dangerous desire to jerk me from my seat. The rhythm of the music, which had seemed so unnatural at first, began to exert its influence over me. It wasn't that feeling of ease in the joints of the feet and the toes, which might be caused by a Strauss waltz. No, it was much more energetic, material, independent, as though one had encountered a balking horse, which is absolutely impossible to master. And so there was something exciting about this music. And for the first 10 years of the 20th century, it spread up through the Midwest, over to New York, and then in the 19-teens, traveled across the ocean and was hugely popular in Paris and in England, all the way to Russia. Igor Stravinsky said ragtime was his favorite kind of music, and he wrote a piece of ragtime. So this really took off. But just as fast as it became popular, it sort of died away. In the early 1920s, when jazz started to rise up, ragtime was kind of considered old-fashioned and not as improvised as jazz was. And so it kind of got lost. And over the next 30 or 40 years, people forgot what ragtime was. And it wasn't until the 1960s when an author named Rudy Blesh wrote a book called They All Played Ragtime. And he began to discover much about Joplin and some of these other composers. And then in 1973, the great film The Sting came out, and that really popularized it. And The Entertainer was sort of the theme song for that music. Joplin actually died penniless and in a pauper's tomb with nothing to his name, but he had told a friend, he said, 50 years from now, they will recognize my great music. And he was absolutely right, but it did take 50 years to sort of come back and hear it. So we thought we'd give you first The Entertainer and then the Ragtime Dance. Please welcome Francis and Emmanuel Borowsky. But before ragtime had become popular, this music that we're going to now play, the spirituals, were really sort of the centerpiece of great music in the African-American community. This was music that had been brought along as they were slaves, much of it from Africa, but it blended in with the Christian hymn tradition that they were sort of forced to become when they were here. And even though the masters could kind of deprive all of the slaves of their languages and their families and their cultures, they could not take away their music. And this was really music that helped uplift these people during some terrible times of suffering. And it really expresses all the suffering in the body, and the mind, the protests against justice. And the spirituals were also used as coded language, especially during the time of the Underground Railroad, as slaves were trying to escape. Songs like Steal Away or Wade in the Water or Deep River had connotations about them to that this was the time to make the go for it. So there was a lot of power in this music. And after the Civil War ended, and the slaves were freed, there was some fear that maybe this music would go away. It was it was music that had started out in the fields with people singing. But luckily, a new university started in Nashville, Tennessee, the Fisk University in the 1870s. And there were a group called the Fisk Jubilee Singers. And in a way to raise money for the university, this is a black university, they decided to form a chorus, a spiritual chorus. And they started reviving these spirituals and making arrangements of them and writing them down so that they could last. And they toured all across the United States, bringing this music to people who really hadn't heard it, and then ultimately across to Europe. And we'll see how the last composer in the half, Samuel Coleridge-Taylor, was a British composer, and he had never heard spirituals until the Fisk Jubilee Singers brought them to London in the 1890s. Now, once these spirituals started getting out there, many more people began to write them down, make arrangements of them. One of the great arrangers was a guy named Hall Johnson, and in the 1920s, he described what the spirituals meant to him and to the world. He said, "True enough, this music was transmitted to us through humble channels, but its source is that of all great art everywhere, the unquenchable, divinely human longing for a perfect realization of life. It traverses every shade of emotion without spilling over in any direction. Its most tragic utterances are without pessimism, and its lightest, brightest moments have nothing to do with frivolity. In its darkest expressions, there is always a hope, and in its gayest measures, a constant reminder of suffering. Born out of the heart cries of a captive people who still do not forget how to laugh, this music covers an amazing range of mood. Nevertheless, it is always serious music and should be performed seriously in the spirit of its original conception." Now, one of the first of the great European composers who recognized how wonderful the spirituals were was the Czech composer Antonín Dvořák. He had sort of helped discover Czech folk music while he was over there. And in 1892, Dvořák was invited to the United States to become the first director of our first National Conservatory of Music in New York, sort of near where Juilliard is now. And Dvořák came over and started traveling around the United States. And he was amazed by all the different kinds of music he heard. He went out to the west, he heard some of the Native American chants, he went down south, he heard some of the Appalachian folk songs, but most importantly, he started listening to these spirituals, and he was sort of so moved by them, and he started telling the people who went to his school, this is your music, this is American music, this is what you need to include in the music that you write in the classical world. Stop trying to write bad European music, use your own folk music. And he said, "The inspiration for a truly American national music must be derived from the Negro melodies. I was led to take this view by the fact that the so-called plantation songs are indeed the most striking and appealing melodies that have yet been found on this side of the water. The most potent as well as most beautiful among them are the spirituals and slave songs, all of which are distinguished by unusual and subtle harmonies, the likes of which I have found in no other songs but those of old Scotland and Ireland." And one last quote I want to do is from W.E.B. Du Bois, his wonderful The Souls of Black Folk, written in 1903. And he started talking about what the United States, how the spirituals were the great music of the United States. He said, "Little of beauty has America given the world, save the rude grandeur that God himself stamped on her bosom. The human spirit in this new world has expressed itself in vigor and ingenuity rather than in beauty. And so by fateful chance, the Negro folk song, the rhythmic cry of the slave, stands today not simply as the sole American music, but as the most beautiful expression of human experience born on this side of the seas. It has been neglected, it has been and is half despised, and above all, it has been persistently mistaken and misunderstood. But notwithstanding, it still remains as the singular spiritual heritage of our nation and the greatest gift of the Negro people. Through all the sorrow of the spirituals, there breathes a hope, a faith in the ultimate justice of things. The minor cadences of despair change often to triumph and calm confidence. Sometimes it is faith in life. Sometimes it is faith in death. Sometimes assurance of boundless justice in some fair world beyond. But whichever it is, the meaning is always clear, that sometime, somewhere, men will judge men by their souls and not by their skins. Is such a hope justified? So powerful words from 100-something years ago that are still important today. So we're going to start off with a work by Undine Smith Moore, wonderful woman composer born in 1904 and lived until 1997. She was the granddaughter of slaves and grew up in Virginia, and she attended Fisk University and then was one of the first to get a full scholarship to go to the Juilliard School of Music, first African-American women, and then got a master's degree from Columbia as well, and taught for many years at the Virginia State College, where she co-founded the Black Music Center, a center where a lot of composers, black composers, came to try out their music. She wrote a number of wonderful pieces, not many of which are played, unfortunately. She was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for a big oratorio called The Scenes from the Life of a Martyr that she wrote just after Martin Luther King was assassinated. A really great piece if you can hear it. And she once said, "Art preserves life in a very special way. Our memories might die with us, but art preserves our values and our experiences." So we're going to play her Afro-American suite, written in about 1968. It's really for flute, cello, and piano, but we're going to have the flute part on the violin. I think it works. And there are four different movements, four different spirituals that she takes. In the first one, you'll hear a combination of "Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen" and "Brothers, Will You Pray for Me?" And this starts off with a beautiful cello solo. Then there's a nice call and response between the cello and the violin. It builds up in intensity, and then we finish back with that cello solo. We then hear a fast one called "I Heard the Preaching of the Elder, Preaching the Word of God." Then there's another very beautiful, slow, and just melancholy "Who is that yonder? Oh, it looks like my Lord coming in a cloud." And finally, we get to shout all over God's heaven. So again, back and forth between the hope and the despair, but it's all in there. So here's Undine Smith Moore. Oh, and I forgot to mention it. In the first one, you'll hear some rather dissonant chords, things that sound a little bit off. And to me, I think it's more trying out some chords that really express that suffering in powerful ways. So you can listen to that. Our last composer on the first half, as I mentioned, is actually a British composer. His name is Samuel Coleridge-Taylor. He was named after the famous poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and had a rather interesting birth story. He was born in 1875. His mother, Alice, was a white woman living in outside of London. I got to stand back here, don't I? So she was living in London, and there was his father was a physician who was living in Sierra Leone, who had come up to London to study, do some studies in medicine. They had obviously gotten together at some point, and then he actually went back to Sierra Leone not knowing that she was pregnant. I don't know if he was ever told, but he grew up then with just his mother and the mother's parents. And the mother's parents were very good amateur musicians. And so when Samuel was 4 years old, they gave him his first violin, and apparently he took to it very quickly. And by the time he was 9, they had put him into the Royal Conservatory of Music to play the violin. Really talented kid. And then soon after, he started taking composition lessons with Stanford Villiers, who's one of the sort of famous composers of the time. And then Edward Elgar, probably the most famous English composer, heard one of his early works and sort of became his mentor and tried to help him get his music published. He would ultimately write his first, most famous piece was a cantata called Song of Hiawatha. This was based upon Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem about Hiawatha, which really hit Samuel Coleridge-Taylor hard. He loved it. And that oratorio was one of the most popular pieces in England for the first 20 years of the century. Only Handel's Messiah was performed more often than that piece. So it really was well known. And he so loved this piece that when he ultimately got married himself, his first son, he named him Hiawatha, which is a rare name. And he started teaching at the Crystal Palace School of Music, and then began to make some visits to the United States. I forgot to mention, so he started trying to discover more about his father and some of the his ancestry. And while he was doing, what he discovered was that there were a group of slaves in the American Revolution who, when the British came in, they freed them. And a large group ended up going to a colony in Nova Scotia. But it was so cold in Nova Scotia that they ultimately made their way down to Sierra Leone. And so his father had actually grown up in that as a slave, or the grandfather of his father. So he felt this real kinship to that music. And when the Fisk Jubilee Singers came over in 1898 and he heard spirituals for the first time, he was so moved that he began to make his own arrangements of spirituals. He did about 24 of them for piano alone, and then he did 5 for piano trio in 1905, and we're going to play those today. He was ultimately invited to the United States on a couple occasions, and in 1904, he actually became the second person of African heritage to go into the White House through the front door. Booker T. Washington had gone in earlier in 1904, and Samuel Coleridge-Taylor was invited by Theodore Roosevelt because he so much loved the Hiawatha oratorio. And so he really was fairly well known. There's actually a school named after him down in Baltimore. There was a whole choral society named after him in D.C. But sadly, his music has been forgotten. Part of the problem is that he dies at the age of 37 from pneumonia. So we don't have a lot of his music. On his tombstone is actually a quote from Hiawatha's oratorio. It says, "Too young to die, his great simplicity, his happy courage in an alien world, his gentleness made all that knew him love him." So we're going to do another 5 of these spirituals here. We're starting off with one of my favorite spirituals, "Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child," just a poignant arrangement of that. Then one called "I Was Way Down at Yonder." The third one, "Didn't My Lord Deliver Daniel?" Then "They Will Not Lend Me a Child." And the last one, "My Lord Delivered Daniel." So I'm going to get delivered twice in this one. So we hope you enjoy it. After this, we'll take a little break. There are 2 bathrooms back here, one right here, one in the back. So help yourself to that. We'll come back in about 10 minutes for the second half. Here's Samuel Coleridge-Taylor.